Father, may my words be like your words spoken through the prophet Isaiah. As the rain and snow come down from heaven, and do not return to it without watering the earth, making it bud and flourish so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater. So it is with the words that go out from my mouth. They will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purposes for which I sent them. Amen. We have two Old Testament scriptures today. We will use just the one response after the second one. And just a little bit of background as I start the first one. I know I did this text here last year, I think. Saul, the first king of Israel, has been king. He was anointed by the prophet Samuel. God had chosen him through Samuel. Saul started out okay, then kind of got too big for his own britches and decided he didn't need to follow or pay attention to what God told him. So eventually God grew tired of that and withdrew his favor from Saul. Saul's still king, but he no longer has God's favor. And God decides it's time for a new king, so he contacts Samuel again. That's where the story starts today. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? For I have rejected him as king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul finds out, he'll kill me." God said, "Take a heifer with you. Say that you have come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice. I'll show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one that I indicate." Samuel did as the Lord commanded. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they saw him approaching. "Do you come in peace?" they asked. "Yes," he said, "in peace. I've come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord." "Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands before the Lord." The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse had Abinadab pass in front of Samuel. Samuel said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had Shammah pass in front of Samuel. Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen these." Then he said to Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse said, "Well, they're still the youngest. He's tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So they sent for him and brought him in. He was glowing with health, with a fine appearance and handsome features. The Lord said to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took his horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that time on, the Spirit of the Lord rested powerfully upon David. Now, we'll skip ahead a little bit. The Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sukkah in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-Dammim between Sukkah and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and pitched camp in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He wore a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of scale armor of bronze that weighed 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung across his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went before him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, then we will become your servants." But if I can overcome and kill him, then you will become our subjects and serve us. Then he said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Choose a man and have him fight me. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were dismayed and terrified. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the battle. The name of the first one was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tending his father's sheep. For 40 days the Philistine came out every morning and every evening and made his stand. Now Jesse had said to David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses for the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring some assurance from them. They were with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David loaded his things, left the sheep in the care of a shepherd, and headed out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp just as the men were going out to their battle positions, shouting the war cry. David left his things with the keepers of the supplies, and then went to the battle line to see his brothers. While he was talking with them, Goliath, the champion from Gath, stepped out from his line and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. As happened every day, when the men of Israel saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the men of Israel had been saying to one another, you see how this fellow keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who can kill him. He will also give his daughter in marriage and exempt his family from taxes in Israel. David said, what will be done for the man who can kill this Philistine and remove this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The men repeated what they had been saying. This is what will be done for the man who can kill him. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with rage against him. He said to David, what have you come down here for, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how wicked you are and how conceited your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Now what have I done, said David. Can't I even speak? He then turned to some other men and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul said, you cannot go out and fight against him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. David said to Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried a sheep off from the flock, I went after it, grabbed it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I grabbed it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Saul then dressed David in his own tunic. He put a bronze helmet on his head and a sword across his chest. David tried walking around, but he could not because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then, with his staff in his hand, he chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. Then, with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked him over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He shouted to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? He said, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David said to Goliath, you come at me with sword and spear and javelin. I come at you in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day he will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Let all gathered here know that it is not by sword or the spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his pouch, he took out a stone and slung it at the Philistine. The stone struck him in the forehead and sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Thus, with a sling and a stone, David defeated the Philistine. Without a sword in his hand, he killed him. David ran to the Philistine and stood over him. He drew the Philistine's sword from its sheath, and after he had killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistine army saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued them to the gates of Ekron and the entrance to Gath. Their dead were scattered along the Sharaim road from Gath to Ekron. After the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He took the giant's own weapons and put them in his own tent. When Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner said, "As surely as you live, my lord, I don't know." Saul said, "Find out whose son that young man is." When David returned from defeating the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him to Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Saul said to David, "Whose son are you, young man?" David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." This is the story of our people.
And what a story it is.
Is one of the most intriguing in the Bible. Some parts of his story are well known, others obscure. You probably learned about his battle with Goliath in Sunday school before you were old enough to read. David could be humble. David could be conceited. He was loyal to King Saul. He became his father-in-law. And he fought against Saul. He fought against the Philistines, and David fought for the Philistines. He wrote some of our most beloved psalms, and he committed murder to cover up an adulterous affair. King Saul had given him his daughter in marriage, and then Saul had tried to kill David with his own spear. As a lad, David had comforted the haunted King Saul with his musical ability, but on the day of David's greatest triumph, Saul had no idea who David was. David was Israel's greatest king, but he left behind children that hated each other so much that his entire kingdom fell apart in one generation, never to be restored. Saul came onto the scene when the people demanded a king. God, through the prophet Samuel, had tried to discourage the idea, but the people got what they asked for, a king, so they could be like all the other nations, like the Egyptians, the Philistines, the Amalekites. They had God as their king, but that wasn't good enough. So, against his better judgment, God granted them a king, and Saul was chosen. A keeper of donkeys, it seems that Saul's primary qualification was that he was really tall. Fortunately, we don't pick our leaders today based on such shallow credentials. So long as Saul heeded the word of the Lord, he was successful. He was often at battle with the neighboring peoples who weren't just about to step aside and grant the Israelites their promised land. But eventually, God grew weary of Saul's disobedience, and God told Samuel that he had rejected Saul as king. And even though Samuel had also long grown weary of Saul, he grieved at the notion that the man that he had anointed as king had failed in the eyes of God. The last straw was Saul's contrived story about saving from the sword the best of the Amalekite sheep and cattle, that he was going to use them as an offering to the Lord. Samuel told Saul to his face that God had rejected him as king. Perhaps Samuel felt ashamed for his part in making Saul the king. The Bible tells us that God was sorry that he had picked Saul. So God gives Samuel another task, find a new king. Samuel balks at this at first. God, we still have a king, and he's not going to be real happy about me looking for his replacement. The fact that God had withdrawn his favor from Saul by no means curbed his power. For Samuel to anoint another person as king would be seen by Saul as an act of treason. Samuel knew that he was risking his head, so God devises a cover-up plan. Take a heifer with you, God says. Tell them you're going to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. That'll give you a legitimate reason to be in Bethlehem. And God's plan worked, as it always does, when his people act in an obedient manner. Samuel did what the Lord said. The townspeople aren't too happy to see Samuel at first. They must figure he's coming to town to straighten them out, to pronounce judgment. Instead, Samuel invites him to a sacrifice and makes sure that Jesse and his sons will be there so he can get a good look at them, so he can get it right this time. As soon as Samuel sees Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, he's certain this is the one. He must have fit Samuel's notion as to what a king must look like. But God doesn't see it that way. He scolds Samuel for being so shallow. Look beyond what you can see. Don't look at his physical characteristics, God says. Look at his heart. Jesse parades each of his sons in front of Samuel by order of birth. But each one fails the heart test. By the time the seventh has passed by, Samuel must figure he had the wrong Jesse. Are these all the sons you have? He asked Jesse. We know that Jesse's up there in years. Maybe he's lost count. Maybe with a hint of shame, Jesse tells Samuel, well, there's still the youngest. He's tending the sheep. Had he been thought so unimportant that they forgot to invite him to the sacrifice? Samuel tells Jesse to go get his youngest. The festivities won't begin until he arrives. So they send for him. As soon as David comes before Samuel, it's obvious to Samuel that he's got his man, or boy, partly because he looked good, but mostly because God said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So there in front of God and the elders of town and his father and his 7 brothers, David was anointed king over Israel. Of course, Saul had a long lame duck period, probably about 20 years. But the Spirit of God had removed itself from Saul and rested on David. What did God see in a young shepherd boy that set him apart for a lifetime of service to God? How did someone almost forgotten by his own family become the one we remember as a giant killer, the one to whom God promised a kingdom that would last forever? Maybe God picked a shepherd because he needed somebody to tend his flock, just as 1,000 years later, Jesus picked fishermen to be his disciples, to be fishers of men. And over the next several years, David needed all the help he could get. Even though David was waiting for the throne, he served Saul by playing his harp. Not old enough to be one of the regular army, David had to excuse himself from the king's service from time to tend Jesse's sheep back in Bethlehem. Later, while David is back home with his flock, Saul and his army have hunkered down on a hillside in the valley of Elah, facing off against the Philistines. Again, we know that the Philistines had superior weapons and equipment, but they were not able to navigate the hilly terrain where the Israelites had positioned themselves. So it came down to a standoff and a war of words. Let's see who blinks first. The two nations had met on the battleground often, but this time the Philistines had a new weapon, a giant named Goliath. It was common in those days for the two sides to each choose one warrior to battle each other, winner take all. For 6 weeks, the massive Philistine had stepped out from his lines and shouted across the valley to Saul's army, "Send me a man to fight." And he goes even further by saying, "This day I defy the armies of Israel." It had to be humiliating for Saul and his men that nobody had the courage to stand up to his taunts. Was this giant more powerful than their God? At this point, young David enters the picture. His father had been concerned about the well-being of his 3 sons who were fighting with Saul, and he wants David to go and check on them and take them some supplies. David reaches camp just as the men are headed out from their encampments toward the battle line. It's first thing in the morning, everybody's charged up and raring to go. And they're shouting the war cry as they take up their positions on the hillside. David hustles to the line to check on his brothers, as he was sent to do. Jesse wants them to bring back some assurance that they're okay. While he's talking with them, David sees and hears Goliath as he stepped out in front of the Philistine line to shout his challenge across the valley floor to the Israelites. At this point, as happened every day, the Israelite army ran and hid. What a shock it must have been for David to see the cowardice of his people, his brothers, and his king. Does no one have the courage to fight this giant? David hears the soldiers talking among themselves. They say that Saul has offered a large reward for the man who can defeat Goliath. Wealth, the king's daughter, an exemption from taxes. You wonder if Saul started low and had to keep upping the ante when nobody stepped up to his offer. This is not Israel's first encounter with giants. Remember why they were punished with 40 years of wandering in the desert? Because when they first came to the edge of the promised land, the spies they sent to check it out came back with a terrifying report. The land is full of giants. Only Joshua and Caleb were courageous enough to trust that the Lord would see them through, as the Lord had promised. But they were shouted down by the people. And as a result, none of those who had fled Egypt made it to the promised land, except Joshua and Caleb. David is intrigued by the promise of riches and glory for the man who will step up. He asks several of the men nearby just to make sure he understands the prize. His conversations are overheard by his older brother Eliab, who explodes in a jealous rage. He's probably been envious of David since the encounter with Samuel, and he's probably embarrassed that his little brother sees him and his other brothers cowering from this giant with the rest of the army. Get out of here, little boy, David is told in so many words. Go back and watch that small flock you're so proud of. But David isn't deterred. Eventually, somebody picks up pieces of David's conversation and reports it to Saul. Saul sends for this fellow who seems to want the chance to fight the giant. And Saul's heart has to sink when David is brought to him and Saul sees that he's just a boy with no armor, no spear, no shield. All that David has is the confidence that God would do what God said he would do, and that he would be with the Israelites. This isn't David's first rodeo. He didn't have a radio. As a shepherd out in the desert, he's fought a lion and a bear as they tried to take one of his sheep. David knows where his strength comes from his trust in the Lord. David doesn't see the looming battle as David versus Goliath or the Philistines versus the armies of Saul. It's a battle between Goliath and God. David convinces Saul that he's up to the challenge, and Saul reluctantly sends him out, but not before giving David his own armor. But with Saul being such a large man, and David still a young man, the size and weight of the armor and equipment are much too great for David, so he discards them. I don't need them, he tells the king. And then David advances from the line toward Goliath, carrying only a stick and a sling. What is Goliath thinking as he sees somebody finally accepting his challenge? Have they found a mighty warrior? When David gets close enough, Goliath sees it's just a young man with no visible weapon, except a stick, and no body protection. Goliath has to figure this will be a piece of cake. David and Goliath exchange threats as they narrow the distance between them. The giant has over 100 pounds of brass armor covering his body, a sword, a javelin, a spear that has a point that weighs over 10 pounds, and a soldier with him protecting him with a shield. David has a bag full of smooth stones. And God. Really, it's not much of a fight. David, who's probably spent much of his solitary time while watching sheep, practicing with his slingshot, fires the first and only shot of the battle. And Goliath falls face down, dead. As the shield bearer and the rest of the Philistine army turn tail and beat feet, David makes good on his promise to Goliath. He stands over his dead body, and with the giant's own massive sword, cuts off his head. As the Israelite army chases the Philistines out of their country, David takes a few souvenirs home from the battle: Goliath's weapons and Goliath's head. He is brought back before Saul so Saul can find out for sure who he is. Saul's gratitude to David was soon replaced by jealousy as he realized that David was now the hero, that David took down the giant that Saul was afraid to face. This story isn't just about war or weapons or even about the underdog winning the battle. It's about how we face the giants in our lives, and we all have them. Our giant might be an addiction, a troubled relationship, a financial mess, a health issue, a loss. We need to face our giants the same way that David did, with the confidence that God will hold up his end of the bargain, that if we will be God's people, then God will be our God. In the shadow of a giant, we can run and hide. We can weigh ourselves down with useless armor, or we can face down the giant with the God-given gifts and talents and weapons that he has so graciously given to us. When fighting a giant, we are to use God's weapons, not the giant's weapons. David didn't defeat Goliath because he was the strongest person in Israel, or maybe even because he didn't have the best aim with a slingshot. Surely any number of young shepherds could have done the same thing. He wasn't the fiercest or most celebrated and decorated warrior. He didn't have the best weapons or the best armor. He took the skill that God had given him and trusted that God would deliver him. Maybe the giant that we face is our culture, our society that often seems like it's turned its back on God. Does the voice of the church get lost? What weapons do we take to battle? In the end, the story is not about David's power and might, but that the God that he trusts, that he serves, the God who went before him, is the one who is great. King Saul and the Israelites focused on the size of the giant rather than on the size of God. Don't measure yourself against yourself. Don't measure your giant against yourself. Measure it against God. At some point in our lives, every one of us lives in Goliath's shadow. Getting out from under that shadow is good news. Freedom from the giants is the gospel. When facing down a giant, we would be well advised to remember the last words that David said to Goliath. The battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into our hands. Thanks be to God.
Thank you for letting us share our worship service with you today. We invite you to join us in person next Sunday at 10:30, or if you prefer, to listen online Sunday afternoon. If you would like to make a donation, please visit our website at www.marionpress.org and click the Donate Now button. May God bless you and have a great week.